With the mind map on glycogen metabolism, we'll try and brainstorm and remember the general aspects of glycogen, the pathway of glycogen storage, UDP, glucose formation, enzyme involved, and glycogen synthesis, and also the pathway of glycogen degradation, the structure and properties of glycogen, the synthesis of UDP glucose, and its role as a precursor in a number of metabolic pathways, including glycogen synthesis, and also the steps and enzymes involved in glycogen synthesis and degradation. We try and remember the role of glycogen and the primary tissues involved in its metabolism. Right, so um, remember that glucose residues is linked up the alpha 1 4 alpha 1 6 bonds, glycosidic bonds, and there is a reducing end and a non-reducing end for these residues. Okay, so with the general aspects of glycogen, note that microscopically it consists of small cytoplasmic granules, which is often close to the endoplasmic reticulum, and branch-chain homopolysaccharides made from alpha D glucose, and is highly regulated or highly associated with water, about 1.1 grams per, or even more than 1 to 3 grams with loosely bound water, and the enzymes which synthesize and degrade glycogen. The liver normally contains about 400 millimoles per kilogram up to 10%, and the muscle contains about 85 millimoles per kilogram, that's 1 to 2% of this glycogen. And since there is more muscle than liver, the total body contains contents correspond to about 0.6 moles in the liver and 2.4 moles in the muscle in a 70 kilogram person. So estimated that about 50 millimoles are used during the first hour of exercise. So there is so much influence on liver glycogen, and the main ones are diet and exercise. So with the liver glycogen content, at AM for instance, it will be a bit high. At noon it drops, and then by evening or dinner it increases up. Once the meal's been taken in, then it drops by 4 a.m. but goes up again after a heavy meal, where there's conversion of the glucose to glycogen. So that is just a simple variation of the liver glycogen content during the day. So the liver is relatively selfless, supplying glucose to the body, and this makes the glycogen levels fluctuate. So the muscle glycogen levels are more constant, except during vigorous exercise. And the blood glucose levels remain relatively constant in a well-fed person. So the blood glucose is typically 4 to 6 millimoles, and the importance of this is observed in the clinic, where hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia cause diabetic coma. So glycogen mobilization is the intermediate mechanism to maintain blood glucose. And the pathway of glycogen storage, you can think of UDP, glucose formation, where synthesis of glycogen revolves around the use of uridine diphosphates glucose, and that's a UDP glucose or UDPG as the active energy-rich donor molecule. So UDP glucose is very important compound, which is used not just for glycogen synthesis but also for other key synthesis, which we'll look at later. So the glucose 6 phosphate is converted to glucose 1 phosphate by phosphogluconutase, and then from glucose 1 phosphate to uridine diphosphate glucose. Right, so the enzymes involved here, we have your hexokinase phosphorylase, um, it, it phosphorylates glucose as well as other hexoses, and this irreversible phosphorylation traps glucose in the cytosol, as there are no specific transmembrane carriers for phosphorylated sugars. So the glucose 6 phosphate is committed to further metabolism, that is gluconeogenesis, also generates glucose 6 phosphate. The phosphogluconutase is an enzyme that converts the glucose 1 phosphate into glucose 6 phosphate. And also it plays a very important role in preparing glycogen and fructose derivatives for glycolysis or the release into the bloodstream. Alternatively, the reverse reaction may be favored in skeletal muscle and the liver as an intermediate stage in glycogenesis. So UDP glucose pyrophosphorylase synthesizes UDP glucose from UTP and glucose 1 phosphate, and you have to note that the conversion of glucose 1 phosphate to UDP glucose is unfavorable. However, the overall reaction is irreversibly driven by the favorable energetic of the ubiquitous pyrophosphate or pyrophosphatase, which hydrolyzes the pyrophosphate to 2 inorganic phosphates. So the importance of UDP glucose, glucose 6 phosphate to UDP glucose, and the UDP glucose could be used in galactose metabolism, glycogen synthesis, glycolipid synthesis, drug solubilization, glycoprotein synthesis, and also protein polysaccharide synthesis. The UDP glucose is very, very important. But the glycogen synthesis is carried out by the enzyme glycogen synthase, which is the tetramer with about 90k DA subunits and closely associated with 2 glycogen particles. The primer is essential for this activity, and glycogen itself is an excellent substrate. Glycogen synthase works poorly to synthesize glycogen from single glucose molecules or short glucose chains, and in the absence of glycogen fragments, the protein glycogenin serves as a very good primer, and the glucosal units are added from UDP glucose to a hydroxyl group of a specific tyrosine on glucogenin. So after the transfer of the first few glucose molecules, glycogen synthase then acts on the substrate. So glycogenin, that's like OH, tyrosine to glycogenin, UDP glucose is being utilized to, and then UDP is being released, but the glucose is being attached to the glycogenin. Another UDP glucose comes into the equation. Another, that is the self-glycosylating, that is when the glucose is being added to the glycogenin, and then the glycogenin finally by the glycogen synthase is being formed. So with the elongation, it keeps on elongating it. The basic elongation of the existing chain involves the transfer of the glucose from the UDP glucose and the formation of 1,4 glycosidic bonds at the non-reducing ends of the chain, and the reaction is catalyzed by glycogen synthase. So with the branching, once the original linear chain reaches at least 11 1 to 4 residues, a branching enzyme known as the glucosyl 4,6 transferase, also known as amylo 1,4,1,6 transglucosidase, transfers between 5 and 8 residues from the non-reducing end of the chain to a 6 hydroxyl group on the internal glycosyl residue. And this is achieved by breaking a 1,4 bond and creating a new 1,6 linkage. And this action creates a highly branched structure of glycogen. So glycogen is 93% 1,4 and 7% 1,6. The branching is actually favored because it is more stable, and after elongation of the two non-reducing ends, their terminal 5,8 glucosyl residue can be removed to further um, branches. Alright, so with the advantages of branching, the molecule is more soluble than a linear molecule, for example, plant amylose, and there are far more ends to add glycosyl residues to, and increasing the rate of synthesis. There are more ends to remove, increasing the rates of degradation if you have it has to be utilized. And with the pathway of glycogen degradation, the degradation is not the reversal of the synthesis. The key enzyme involved is phosphorylase, and phosphorylase causes a phosphorylysis, not hydrolysis. So phosphorylysis of the 1,4 glycosidic bonds. It begins at the terminal units from the non-reducing end, and high inorganic phosphate levels, about 5 millimoles in the cell, usually drive the reaction towards the product, glucose 1,6 phosphate. And phosphorylase works steadily, digesting the branches of glycogen until there are 4 residues remaining from a 1,6 branch point. So the phosphorylase cannot degrade this molecule, termed the limit dextrin, any further. So the limit dextrin cannot be further broken down, degraded by the phosphorylase, and then a new enzyme, the amylo 1,6 glucosidase, that is a debranching enzyme, comes involved. So first it acts like the branching enzyme, but in reverse, transferring 3 residues to the linear 1,4 chain, and the remaining 1,6 bond is hydrolyzed by the same enzyme with water, yielding free glucose. And then a small amount of glucose will be formed from the breakdown of glycogen, even in the muscle, and theoretically glucose could exit to the blood and serve as a fuel for the brain. With the regulation of the glycogen enzymes, think of hormonal regulation by glycogen metabolism, allosteric regulation, calcium, and also AMP. So with what limits the extent of glycogen deposition and granule size is not known, but skeletal muscles contains a much less, about 85 millimoles per kilogram, than liver, which is 400 millimoles per kilogram, and the liver content is relatively constant. The liver content can increase or decrease according to dietary conditions, and remember, the liver is unselfish, supplying glucose to the blood. So a great deal is known about the detailed regulation of both the synthetic and degradative enzymes, glycogen phosphorylase and glycogen synthase. So the knowledge of this regulation has been fundamental in understanding the general principles behind the metabolic regulation of a host of other enzymes and pathways. The enzymes in general are regulated by enzyme amount, transcription, translation, proteolysis, and mass action, which has to do with the concentration of the reactants, and also enzyme activity, which is a non-covalently small via small molecules and covalently by phosphorylation of serine, threonine, and tyrosine residues, as well as other covalent modifications, and by signaling cascades, which may involve protein kinases, phosphatases, as well as proteases. With the regulation of glycogen enzymes, the enzymes of both glycogen synthesis and degradation demonstrate both covalent and non-covalent regulation, as well as signaling cascades, and the enzymes exist as complexes where the critical participants are localized to enhance catalytic efficiency by effectively concentrating enzymes and substrate in space. So remember that glycogen synthesis regulated by glycogen synthase and glycogen degradation is regulated by glycogen phosphorylase, and these enzymes are associated to hormonal regulation and allosteric regulation by metabolites in response to the energy needs of the cell. With the hormonal regulation of glycogen metabolism, let's try and brainstorm. Remember the three hormones: insulin, epinephrine, and glycogen. So with insulin, the hormone secreted by the beta cells of the pancreatic islets of Langerhans in response to a rise in blood glucose, and its release is decreased in response to epinephrine. And insulin stimulates glucose uptake and glycogenesis and inhibits glycogen degradation. It also acts through tyrosine kinases. And you have to remember insulin and glucose transport to the brain. Epinephrine or adrenaline is biologically active amine synthesized in the adrenal medulla and is secreted in response to low blood glucose, exercise, cold, and fright. And it stimulates an increase in the degradation of glycogen and it acts through the adenylate cyclase enzyme. So with glucagon is a hormone secreted by the alpha cells of the pancreatic islet of Langerhans, and it opposes the action of insulin, activates the liver glycogenolysis and also gluconeogenesis. And release is stimulated by low blood glucose amino acids, epinephrine, and is inhibited by high glucose and insulin, and acts through adenylate cyclase. With allosteric regulation, glycogen synthase and phosphorylates are regulated allosterically, that is by the levels of substrate and metabolites, and glycogen synthase is activated by high concentration of GSP, and also phosphorylase is inhibited by high levels of GSP and ATP and glucose in the liver. So in the liver, the hormone epinephrine stimulates FBPase activity of the Dublin headed enzyme PFK2 and FBPase 2. So in the muscle, epinephrine stimulates the activity of the enzyme PFK1 phosphokinase 1. So what is the adaptive significance of this biochemistry in humans, and what's the significance of high levels of hexokinase activity in the brain? Alright, so we'll try and remember that later. With the regulation of calcium, the muscle contraction leads to an increased demand for ATP. So nerve impulses lead to calcium release and muscle contraction, but also comodulin binding to calcium, activation of phosphorylase kinase, activation of glycogen phosphorylase, and glycogen degradation occurs. And with the regulation of AMP in extreme conditions of anoxia and ATP depletion, high AMP levels in the muscles lead to AMP binding to glycogen phosphorylase and AMP activation of the glycogen phosphorylase without phosphorylation and glycogen degradation. So AMP does not activate glycogen phosphorylase bound to the glucose already. So with the glycogen storage diseases, they are a group of genetic diseases, and they are now recognized as resulting from defects in the enzymes involved in glycogen synthesis and breakdown. And these conditions are rare, like one in about 40,000 pets, but the study of them have proved useful for understanding glycogen metabolism. So when it comes to the glycogen storage diseases, type 1 von Geck disease, the deficient enzymes, the glucose 6-phosphate, that's the number 1 in 200,000, and the site of the deficiency is the liver and the kidneys. Another deficient enzyme incidence is the lysosomal glycosidase, that's the 1 in 200,000. That is the Pompe's disease, that one is type 2 and it occurs in all tissues. Type 3 is the limit dextrinosis or the Cory's disease, and the the site of deficiency could occur in all tissues, and the deficient enzyme is amylo 1,6 glucosidase. In case number 1 in 200,000 population, that's the incidence. And type 4 glycogen storage diseases, amylopectinosis, and it could occur in all tissues, with the branching enzyme is implicated over is very low in the type 4. Type 5 is the Mac-Aldels disease and occurs in skeletal muscles, and the glycogen phosphorylase levels are very low. With type 6, Hair's disease occurs in the liver erythrocytes, and the deficient enzyme glycogen phosphorylase actually could be absent, very low. And with type 7 occurs in skeletal muscles, the phosphofructokinase is very low. Type 8 in the brain and liver, adenyl cyclase or adenylate cyclase is very low. And then with type 9 occurs in the liver and non-muscle tissues. That one, phosphorylase kinase, is implicated over about 1 in 100,000 have this type 9. And type 10, both in the liver and also protein kinase A is implicated over here. So the Mac-Aldels disease, like I talked about, the type 5, people with type 5 glycogen storage disease or Mac-Aldels disease lack the muscle phosphorylase and accumulates glycogen but survive reasonably. Their problem is one of cramps and pain upon initiation of exercise with no lactate formation, and also characteristic of the disease is a high level of the glycogen in the muscle. Von Gehr's disease, which is type 1, with that one there is a lack of glucose 6 phosphatase, and it's a very serious disease, so it affects both the glycogen degradation and the last step in gluconeogenesis during fasting. And since glucose 6 phosphates cannot be dephosphorylated to release the free glucose, the primary organs affected are the liver and the kidneys. Children are short or children who have large head, huge abdomen due to spleen and liver enlargement could be having this von Gehr disease. Well, those are the syndromes or the signs that you see accompanying the von Gehr disease. And there's hormonal imbalance, hypoglycemia, and prognosis is very poor, with death usually by the age of 4 when it comes to von Gehr. The treatment, there's hints that high protein diet rich in leucine and isoleucine may provide good treatment for Mac-Aldels disease and related glycolytic disorders. That is, with this, it has to do with the England Journal of Medicine. When it comes to von Gehr's disease treatment, gastric infusions of glucose at night or regular administration of uncooked corn starch are used in treatment, and ketogenic amino acids could be utilized to synthesize ketones, which is an alternative energy source which can be reconverted by some peripheral tissues to generate acetyl-CoA. So when it comes to glycogen synthesis and degradation, just a quick recap. Glycogen is a long branch chain polymer of glucose and is a principal storage form of glucose. It's stored in the liver and skeletal muscles. The glycogen stores are used to keep the blood sugar level steady between meals, and is stored as granules in the cytosol. So glycogen to glucose is phosphate to glucose and also to blood glucose, and glycogen to glucose 6 phosphates to energy in the muscles. So the structure, the glycogen is a branch chain polysaccharide made exclusively from alpha D glucose, and the primary glycosidic bond is the alpha 1 4 linkage, but after an average of 8 to 14 glucosylation residues, there's a branch containing an alpha 1,6 linkage. And a single glycogen molecule can contain up to 55,000 glycosyl residues. And with glycogenesis is the synthesis of glycogen from glucose 6-phosphate, and the hormone insulin is responsible for high blood glucose levels, which stimulate the synthesis of glycogen. And when the blood glucose rises, especially after a meal, the beta cells of the pancreas secrete insulin, and it immediately accelerates the uptake of glucose by all the cells of the body except the brain and other body cells. And these cells, within them, the uptake of glucose is insulin independent. That is for the brain and the other body cells. So the liver, insulin promotes glycogen synthesis and storage by inhibiting glycogen phosphorylase and thereby inhibiting glycogen degradation, and it also stimulates glycogen synthase and glucokinase, the two enzymes that are involved in glycogen synthesis. And this reaction occurs in the cytosol. The glycogen formed are stored in the liver and muscle tissues, and the process occurs in the cytosol and requires energy supplied by ATP for the phosphorylation of glucose and uridine triphosphate. So the with glycogenesis, glucose is converted to glucose 6-phosphate using 1 ATP, and the glucose 6-phosphate is further on converted to glucose 1-phosphate, which is activated by UTP, forming UDP glucose. And as the UDP glucose attaches to the end of the glycogen chain, UDP is released and converted to UTP by ATP. With glycogenesis, the alpha D glucose attached to uridine diphosphate. UDP is the source of all the glycosyl residues that are added to the growing glycogen molecule. So UDP glucose is synthesized from glucose 1-phosphate and UTP by UDP glucose phosphorylase, and pyrophosphate. That's PPI is the second product of the reaction. Actually, the pyrophosphate is hydrolyzed to 2 inorganic phosphates by pyrophosphatase, and the hydrolysis is exergonic, ensuring that the UDP glucose phosphorylase reaction proceeds in the direction of UDP glucose production. The glycogen primer, all the glucose moiety from UDP glucose is transferred to a glycogen primer, which is glycogen molecule. So the primer is essential to accept the glycosyl unit, and the primer is made up of protein carbohydrate complex. It's a dimeric protein having 2 identical monomers. An oligosaccharide chain of 7 glucose units is added to each monomer. So the side chain hydroxyl group of tyrosine 194 in the protein is the site at which the initial glucosyl unit is attached. Still on the glycogen primer, the glycogen, because the reaction is catalyzed by glycogen itself via glucosylation. Glycogen is an enzyme, and glycogen then catalyzes the transfer of at least 4 molecules of glucose from UDP glucose, producing a short alpha 1,4 linked glycosyl chain. And this short chain serves as a primer that is able to be elongated by glycogen synthase. So glycogen stays associated with and forms a core of a glycogen granule. So glycogen primer, and under the influence of glycogen synthase, leads to the production of glycogen and UDP. So glycogen primer and UDP plus UDP glucose glycogen synthase comes in and form glycogen and UDP. So at the core of the protein core, you have your glycogen and you have your starch around it. So remember the pathway: glucose 6 phosphate to glucose 1 phosphate, but it could be converted back to glucose 6 phosphate by the phosphoglucomutase, or back to glucose 1 phosphate by the same enzyme phosphoglucomutase, and from glucose 1 phosphate to pyrophosphatase, that is UTP comes in. You get your pyrophosphatase. Under the influence of water, 2 inorganic phosphates are being formed. But from glucose 1 phosphate, UDP glucose phosphorylase can convert the glucose 1 phosphate to UDP glucose. And then at this point, note that you have your glycogen attaching to tyrosine 194, forming the complex, and this comes into the reaction where it's the UDP glucose is attached to this particular complex, like glycogen and the tyrosine 194 complex, and forms another complex, which is the UDP glucose plus the glycogen and tyrosine complex. And from there, glycogen synthase will come in and remove the UDP out and cause the glucose to be attached to the glycogen and tyrosine, and then it keeps on elongating via 1 alpha 1,4 glycosidic bonds. And then at the non-reducing end, or further alpha 1,4 bonds are being formed, glycogen synthase comes in and it still goes on and on. But with the branching, like I talked about, the branching enzyme comes in, which is the 4,6 transferase, and then it forms at the reducing end, it forms the alpha 1,6 bond, which is a branching bond, and there's further elongation at the non-reducing end by the glycogen synthase, making more alpha 1,4 bonds, and further branching making more alpha 1,6 bonds, and the glycogen being formed. So glucose 6 phosphate, glucose 1 phosphate, UDP glucose attached to tyrosine glycogen, and then glycogen synthase keeps on forming more and more and more alpha 1,4 bonds, and alpha 1,6 by the branching enzyme keeps on forming more and glycogen is being formed. So the overall reaction: glucose 2 ATPs, glycogen synthase, glycogen is being formed, ADP, inorganic phosphate. So with the branchings, if no other synthetic enzyme is acted on the chain, the resulting structure would be linear, that is on branch chain of glycosyl unit attached by alpha 1,4 linkages, and such a compound is found in plant tissues and it's called amylose. So in contrast, glycogen has branches located on average 8 glycosyl residues apart, resulting in a highly branched tree-like structure that is far more soluble than the unbranched amylose. The branching also increases the number of non-reducing ends to which new glycosyl residues can be added and removed, and this greatly accelerates the rate at which glycogen synthesis and degradation can occur. So still on the branching, the branch synthesis, the branches are made by the action of the branching enzyme amylo alpha 1,4 to alpha 1,6 transglycosylase, and this enzyme removes a set of 6 to 8 glucosyl residues from the non-reducing end of the glycogen chain, breaking an alpha 1 bond to another residue on the chain and attaches it to a non-terminal glucosyl residue by an alpha 1,6 linkage, and the resulting new non-reducing end, as well as the old non-reducing end from which the 6 to 8 residues are removed, can now be further elongated by glycogen synthase. So remember that with the branching, additional branch synthesis after elongation of the two ends has been accomplished occurs. That is, their terminal 6 to 8 glycosyl units can be removed and used to make additional branches. So with glycogenolysis, that is the breakdown of glycogen to glucose, glycogen phosphorylase removes glucose as glucose 1 phosphate from glycogen, and the glucose is phosphorylated as it is cleaved from the glycogen to form glucose 1 phosphate, and glucose units are removed one at a time. So with glycogenolysis, the enzyme sequentially hydrolyzes alpha 1 4 glycosidic linkages till it reaches a glucose residue 3 4 glucose units away from a branch point, and it cannot attack the 1,6 linkages at branch point. So if the glycogen phosphorylase and alone act on the glycogen molecule, the final product is a highly branched molecule, and which is called the limit dextran. With the branching, the branches are removed by the two enzymatic activities of a single bifunctional protein, the debranching enzyme. So first, the oligo alpha 1,4 to alpha 1,6 glucan transferase activity removes the outer 3 of the 4 glucosyl residues remaining at a branch, and it next transfers them to a non-reducing end of another chain, lengthening it accordingly. And with the debranching, an alpha 1,4 bond is broken and an alpha 1,4 bond is also made, and then the enzyme functions as a 4,4 transferase. But next thing that happens is the remaining glucose residue attached in alpha 1,6 linkage is removed hydrolytically by amylo alpha 1,6 glucosidase activity, releasing the free glucose, and the ribosyl chain is now available again for degradation by glycogen phosphorylase until 4 ribosyl units in the next branch are reached. Remember the dextrin the limit dextrin I talked about. So glucose 1 phosphate is isomerized to glucose 6 phosphate by phosphoglucomutase, and in the liver, glucose 6 phosphate is dephosphorylated to glucose by glucose 6 phosphatase, and the hepatocytes then release the glucose into the bloodstream to help maintain the blood glucose levels. The muscles lack glucose 6 phosphatase, so it cannot be dephosphorylated and sent to the blood. Instead, it enters glycolysis, providing energy needed for muscle contraction. Alright, so there's a quick review or overview of glycogen synthesis and breakdown. So glycogen to glucose 1 phosphate to glucose 6 phosphate, and then finally to glucose. Remember, the glycogen to glucose 1 phosphate is activated by glucagon in the liver and epinephrine in the muscle, and is inhibited by insulin. Yes, but from there to from glucose 1 phosphate to glucose 6 phosphate occurs in the liver and kidney only to glucose. But from the glycogen synthesis, glucose 1 phosphate, glucose utilizes ATP, so ADP will be a byproduct. Glucose 6 phosphate is formed and could lead to the glycolysis pathway, or by activation of insulin, glucose 1 phosphate is being formed, but this is inhibited by glucagon in the liver and epinephrine in the muscle, and this glucose 1 phosphate can go up by utilizing UTP, where two inorganic phosphates are being formed, and UDP glucose is being formed, which can go ahead and form the glycogen. Alright, so Still on the glycogenolysis, two hormones control glycogenolysis and the degradation of glycogen, like I said. So these are the peptide hormone I talked about: glucagon, which is synthesized in the pancreas, the alpha cells, and epinephrine, which is produced in the adrenal glands. So glucagon is released from the pancreas in response to low blood glucose, and epinephrine is released from the adrenal glands in response to a threat or stress. That's like the sympathetic flight of fright. Yeah, so both situations required increasing blood glucose, and both hormone function by altering the activity of the two enzymes, the glycogen phosphorylase and the glycogen synthase. And with the glycogen phosphorylase is involved in glycogen degradation is activated, but glycogen synthase is involved in glycogen synthesis and is inactivated at this point. But when the body activities need ATP, the glycogen stored in the hepatocyte is broken down into glucose and released into the blood to be transported to the cells where it is catabolized. And glycogenolysis begins with the splitting of glucose molecules from the branch glycogen molecules by phosphorylation to form glucose 1-phosphate in the presence of glycogen phosphorylase. And glucose 1-phosphate, like I said, is converted to glucose 6-phosphate and finally to glucose. So that's it for glycogen metabolism.